Nothing should exist without its shadow, yet this case did. Welcome to Sherlock Holmes. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Share where you're tuning in from. I love hearing from you all. Your presence means a lot. Let's step in. It is a curious truth, proved to me 100 times over in my companionship with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that London possesses secrets not merely in its locked drawers and sealed letters, but in the very behavior of its streets. A man may hide his guilt behind a clean collar. A woman may bury her despair beneath a fashionable bonnet. Yet the city itself, with its fogs and gas lamps, its clatter of hansoms and murmuring crowds, will whisper what the tongue denies. If only one has the rare faculty to listen. I had returned with Holmes that evening from a damp tramp along the embankment, and where a bitter wind came off the river and made our greatcoats seem suddenly inadequate. Our rooms in Baker Street were warm by contrast, the coal fire steady and comforting, the familiar perfume of tobacco lingering in the curtains. Holmes, stretched full length upon the sofa, had assumed that attitude of languid indifference which so often concealed the most active mental toil. I, having shaken the rain from my hat and hung it beside my coat, was settling with my notebook when Mrs. Hudson's gentle knock sounded upon the sitting-room door. "A gentleman to see you, sir," said she, her voice holding that slight tremor which always told me the visitor was neither trivial nor common. Holmes's eyes, which had seemed half-closed, opened at once, keen as a hawk's. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was of a type not unfamiliar to me, well-dressed, well-fed, and yet carrying a certain hunted uneasiness in his glance. He might have been a prosperous tradesman or a minor official raised by diligence rather than pedigree. His frock coat was of excellent cloth, his boots newly polished, his hat brushed to perfection, but he clutched that hat as though it were a shield, and I saw that his knuckles were pale with the pressure. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he began. Holmes waved a hand. "Pray sit down. Dr. Watson is here. You may speak freely." The visitor sat upon the edge of the chair as though prepared to spring up at any moment and flee. "My name is Edmund Holbrook," said he. "I am, at least I was until this morning, the chief clerk at Trench and Fallow, solicitors, Hun of Chancery Lane." Holmes's long fingers steepled themselves. "Indeed. And what calamity has befallen Trench and Fallow that brings their chief clerk to Baker Street at this hour?" Holbrook swallowed. "It is not the firm, sir. It is, God help me, it is myself." Holmes's expression did not soften, but there was an attentive stillness in him that I have learned to recognize as sympathy of a peculiar sort. Sympathy for the puzzle rather than the sufferer. "I have been accused," Holbrook continued, "of theft, of something worse than theft, for it implies deceit. And I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, upon my mother's grave, I have taken nothing." Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he leaned forward and said, in a tone as calm as though he were remarking upon the weather, "You have walked here from Chancery Lane. Yes, you were delayed near the Strand by a frightened horse, and you have been in a heated room immediately beforehand." The man stared. "How can you possibly—" Holmes pointed with his pipe stem. "The mud upon your right boot is the pale clay found near the temple steps, but it is overlaid by a thin streak of darker slush, the sort thrown up by a sudden halt in traffic. Your hatband is damp with perspiration at the front, not the sides, which suggests you have been standing facing a fire rather than walking in cold air. Also, you have ink upon the inside of your left cuff. Clerks rarely blot their own ink there unless they have been hastily gathering papers." Holbrook gave a short, helpless laugh. "They told me you were a wizard." Holmes's lips twitched. "Hardly. Now, Mr. Holbrook, let us come to your accusation." The clerk's face grew grey. "There is a document, sir, a deed, a very old deed connected to the estate of Alderwick in Kent. Trench and Fallow have held it in trust these 50 years. It is valuable, not for the paper, but for what it proves. This morning, Mr. Trench summoned me to the strong room. The deed was missing from its packet. The seal had been broken, and he hesitated, as though the words were shameful. And the packet was found in my own desk. Convenient, Holmes murmured. Too convenient, Halbrook burst out, then caught himself and lowered his voice. I know how it appears. I'm in charge of the keys to the strong room. Only Mr. Trench and I possess them. Mr. Fallow is abroad. They say no one else could have taken it, yet I did not. Holmes' eyes gleamed. And what, precisely, has this to do with a missing shadow? Halbrook's hands began to tremble. That is the most dreadful part, sir. I'd gone early before the others to fetch the packet for copying. I opened the strong room. I remember it clearly because the gas jet hissed and the flame flickered. I stepped inside and... He swallowed again, and I saw sweat bead at his temple. And my shadow did not follow me. Watson would have set down his pen at that moment, for the words were absurd, yet I confess I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river wind. Halbrook leaned toward us, eyes wide. I tell you the truth. The light was behind me. The wall was bare. My coat should have thrown a silhouette upon it. There was nothing. It was as if I had become insubstantial. I stepped back, and in the corridor my shadow returned at once. I stepped in again. Gone. I tried it 3 times, Mr. Holmes. Sir, my shadow vanished in that room. Holmes's gaze sharpened, and for the first time a flicker of genuine interest crossed his face. And you mentioned this to no one? Would you have? Halbrook whispered. They already think me a thief. Holmes rose in one smooth motion, a tall figure framed by firelight. Dr. Watson, said he, you will come with me to Chancery Lane. Mr. Halbrook, you will guide us. If your tale is true, then the missing deed is the least peculiar element in this matter, and yet I suspect the key lies in that very peculiarity. He reached for his coat, his violin case, and his keen grey eyes shone with that cold delight which always came upon him when the world offered something that defied ordinary explanation. Come, said he simply, let us see where a man may lose his shadow. It was close upon 9 when we left Baker Street. The rain had settled into a thin, stubborn fall, turning the lamps to blurred halos and the streets to shining ribbons. Holmes walked quickly at once, collar up, as if the case drew him by a cord. Halbrook kept at his elbow, clutching his hat. A hansom took us eastward. Once a frightened horse balked near a dray and set the line of cabs shuddering. Halbrook started, but Holmes only said, Your desk was locked, duplicate keys in the safe, and yet the packet was found. Convenient facts are often manufactured facts. Chancery Lane received us with its accustomed gloom, windows that glowed with late clerks. A porter admitted us, and, after an uneasy look at Halbrook, led us to an ante-room where a small fire struggled against the damp. Mr. Trench awaited us there, pacing. He was spare and iron-grey. Mr. Holmes, said he, bowing stiffly, the Alderwick deed is missing from our strong room, and the packet was discovered in Halbrook's drawer. He answers with fantasies. Holmes's face remained polite and cold. Show me the strong room. Trench produced a heavy key and led us down to the basement. The passage grew colder. The air smelt of stone. At the end stood an iron-bound door. The lock yielded, and we entered a chamber scarcely larger than a cupboard. Shelves ran along 3 walls with bundles tied in red tape. The 4th wall was bare plaster. A single gas jet hissed above the inner door. Holmes stood still for a heartbeat, then looked to Halbrook. As you did this morning. The clerk placed himself so that the gas jet was behind him and stepped toward the bare wall. Sir, when Halbrook lifted his arm, the plaster showed no dark outline. The room seemed filled with a strange, even brightness that softened every edge. You see, Halbrook whispered. Holmes moved behind him and held his own hand between the flame and the wall. There was only a faint dimming, no clean border. He shifted his hand nearer the plaster. The dimming deepened, but still no sharp silhouette formed. "A shadow," said Holmes quietly, "is only light denied. If light comes from more than one direction, the denial is repaired." Trench made an impatient sound. "Then it is some trick of the gas." Holmes lit a match and held it close to the wall. At once the match threw a crisp, dancing shadow of his fingers. "So the wall is innocent," he murmured. He walked to the gas jet, examined it, then blew out the flame. The chamber fell dark, yet not wholly dark. Upon the plaster opposite lay a thin bar of pale light. "There," said Holmes. Trench stiffened. "Impossible." Holmes struck another match and dropped to one knee, his lens at his eye. He traced the pale bar to a point no broader than a pin's head. The tip of his knife flaked the plaster, revealing clean white beneath. "A hole," said he, "newly made." Halbrook's breath came out in a sob. "Then I was not mad," Holmes finished. "Someone has bored through to admit a second light from the other side. With the gas behind you and that light before you, your outline is washed away. Your missing shadow was arranged." Trench recovered his voice. "Arranged? Why?" Holmes rose and turned to the shelves. His fingers moved among the bundles. He drew one packet, loosened the knot, and lifted out a sheet by its corners. "Not Alderwick," said he, "but handled. Note the clean strip of dust where it lay. Someone searched here." He held out his palm. On the paper's edge was a tiny crumb of reddish-brown wax. "Our seals are black," Trench said, and doubt entered his tone. "Just so," Holmes replied. "This wax has traveled. Another packet was opened elsewhere and carried in, and if a man has taken pains with light, he has taken pains with blame." "Who has been in this room in the last fortnight?" Holmes asked. "Besides you and Halbrook?" "No one," Trench began, then checked himself. "No one with right." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then someone without right has been here. Now, Alderwick, who profits if that deed vanishes?" Trench drew a slow breath. "There is a claimant, Sir Julian Rutherbourne. He believes an old conveyance gives him the estate if the deed supports it. He has pressed us hard. And he has visited your office?" "Twice. In person." Holmes retied the tape and turned toward the stairs. "Dr. Watson, Sir Julian's mind will be active tonight. I prefer to meet an active mind before it sleeps." Halbrook caught at him. "What am I to do?" "Remain where an honest man may be found," said Holmes. "Go home, but do not leave London. If any message comes, note the messenger. And Mr. Trench, you will speak of this hole to no one, but you will quietly watch your safe." Trench's hard face held. "And the deed?" Holmes paused at the threshold. "A thief may conceal," said he, "but he must also use. If Sir Julian, or whoever stands behind him, has risked so much, he will move again, to produce a substitute or to destroy the original. When he moves, we shall be there." Holmes did not at once direct our cab toward Sir Julian Rutherbourne's address, though he had extracted it from Mr. Trench with quiet insistence. Instead, as we emerged once more into the damp night air of Chancery Lane, he paused beneath a lamp and consulted his watch. "10:30, said he. "An hour at least before a gentleman of leisure retires, particularly if that gentleman is engaged in the rearrangement of property." "You think he acts tonight?" I asked. "I think," returned Holmes, drawing his coat closer, "that a man who contrives artificial illumination to abolish a shadow will not delay the second act of his performance. The hole in the plaster was freshly bored. The wax crumb was recent. Our adversary believes himself clever. So such men grow bold in the first glow of success." We took a cab westward, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the wet stones. Sir Julian's residence proved to be a narrow but dignified house in Bedford Square, its windows lit upon the first floor. The brass knocker shone like a small moon against the dark wood. A footman admitted us with some reluctance, but the name of Sherlock Holmes has a curious effect in London drawing rooms. Within minutes, we were shown into a library of severe taste, dark shelves, a Turkey carpet, and a fire burning low. Before it stood Sir Julian himself. He was a tall man of perhaps 45, with a pointed beard and eyes of a pale, penetrating blue. His manner possessed that restrained impatience which I have observed in men accustomed to command, but not to contradiction. "Mr. Holmes," said he, or inclining his head, "to what do I owe this late intrusion?" Holmes returned the bow with equal politeness. "To an old document, Sir Julian, the Alderwick deed." A flicker, no more than the briefest tightening at the corner of the eye, passed across his face. "I had understood," he replied, "that such matters are conducted through solicitors." "Ordinarily, yes. Yet extraordinary circumstances have arisen. The deed has vanished." Sir Julian's brows lifted. "Vanished." "From the strong room of Trench and Fallow, discovered most conveniently among the effects of their chief clerk." A pause followed. Sir Julian crossed to the mantelpiece and rested one hand upon it, his back half turned to us. "That is unfortunate," said he, "but hardly my affair. If the firm cannot guard its own archives—" Holmes's voice cut in, soft but edged. You have pressed them repeatedly for access to the deed." "As is my right. And you have, within the past fortnight, visited their offices in person." "I have." Holmes stepped lightly about the room as though admiring the bindings upon the shelves. "You are aware, no doubt, that if the original deed cannot be produced, secondary claims may falter." Sir Julian turned. "Are you suggesting I would benefit from its disappearance?" "I suggest nothing," said Holmes. "I observe only that motive is the first companion of opportunity." A spark of anger showed at last. "If you have come to accuse me, I have come to ask whether you possess any knowledge of a small quantity of reddish-brown sealing wax." The effect was subtle but decisive. Sir Julian's hand left the mantel and moved, almost involuntarily, toward a small escritoire near the window. Holmes's eyes followed the gesture, as a hawk follows a mouse. "You will forgive my curiosity," Holmes continued, "but Trench and Fallow employ black wax exclusively. Yet in their strong room we discovered a crumb of red-brown wax, of a shade remarkably similar to that used by certain private gentlemen." Sir Julian's voice was cool once more. "Surely sealing wax is hardly a rare commodity." "Not rare," Holmes agreed, "but habits are rarer. A man's choice of wax, like his choice of tobacco, may become as distinctive as his handwriting." Sir Julian laughed lightly. "Then you may inspect mine if you wish. I have nothing to conceal." "On the contrary," said Holmes with a faint smile, "I'm certain you have much to conceal. Now the question is whether it relates to Alderwick." The tension in the room thickened perceptibly. I felt that we stood upon the edge of some revelation, yet Holmes did not press further. Instead, he turned abruptly toward the window. "Tell me, Sir Julian, do you habitually work late?" "Often." "And do you require additional light?" Sir Julian hesitated. "I employ what is necessary." Holmes drew aside the curtain. Across the narrow square, another house stood dark save for a single illuminated attic window. "An odd thing," Holmes murmured. "Light travels faithfully where it is directed." Sir Julian's gaze sharpened. "What are you implying?" "That someone, somewhere, has taken pains with illumination." Holmes let the curtain fall. "We shall not detain you longer, but I advise you, Sir Julian, that the recovery of the Alderwick deed is a matter of hours, not days." For the first time, the man's composure faltered. "Recovery?" he repeated. Holmes inclined his head. "Good evening." We were shown out without further courtesy. Once in the cab, I turned eagerly to my companion. "You believe he has it?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "Belief is the refuge of the unimaginative, Watson. I prefer certainty. Sir Julian is too controlled. His surprise was measured. Either he is innocent, or he is not the hand that executed the deed." Then who? Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. The hole in the plaster required proximity to the adjoining wall. The wax suggests transport. The deed was planted in Holbrook's desk. Sir Julian possesses motive, but not necessarily access. The cab jolted over a rut. Holmes opened his eyes. "There is another actor," said he quietly, "one who stands between the claimant and the strong room. And unless I am mistaken, that actor is already aware that we have discovered the missing shadow." I pressed him further as the cab bore us back through the glistening streets, but Holmes relapsed into that infuriating silence which signified the swift arrangement of facts within his mind. "You speak of another actor," I said at last. "Surely you do not suspect Mr. Trench?" Holmes opened one eye. "I suspect every man until he is cleared by evidence, my dear Watson. But suspicion is not accusation. Consider the geography. The strong-room wall on which the false illumination played must adjoin some other chamber. We did not yet inspect what lies beyond it. Another office, perhaps. Precisely. If light entered through that aperture, then someone had access to the adjoining room at the precise hour when Holbrook first entered the strong room. That person knew his habit of arriving early. You imply foreknowledge." "I imply observation," said Holmes. "Foreknowledge is only observation extended." By the time we reached Baker Street, the rain had ceased, leaving the air raw and metallic. Holmes refused supper, instead spreading a rough plan of Chancery Lane upon the table. He marked the position of Trench and Fallow and, with the aid of a directory, identified the neighboring premises. "Here," said he, tapping the paper. "On one side, a firm of patent agents. On the other, chambers let to a Mr. Felix Armitage, described as a conveyancing consultant." "Conveyancing?" I repeated. Holmes's thin smile returned, not a discipline intimately concerned with deeds and titles. "You think this Armitage involved?" "I think," said Holmes, rising, "that Mr. Armitage merits an early call." It was barely 8 the next morning when we stood once more in Chancery Lane. Holmes had insisted upon speed. The offices of Mr. Felix Armitage occupied a modest suite adjoining that of Trench and Fallow. A brass plate, newly polished, bore his name. Holmes rang without hesitation. The man who admitted us was of middle height, clean-shaven with dark hair carefully parted. His expression, at first polite, tightened perceptibly at the sight of my companion. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said slowly, "to what do I owe this honor?" Holmes's gaze traveled past him into the room beyond. "I understand you practice in matters of property transfer." "I do." "Then you will appreciate my interest in structural arrangements. Might we examine the wall you share with Trench and Fallow?" Armitage's composure wavered for a fraction of a second. "I fail to see—" Holmes stepped forward, and there was something in his manner that brooked no refusal. "It concerns a matter presently under investigation. You would not wish to obstruct justice." After a hesitation, Armitage moved aside. The adjoining room was plainly furnished. A desk, shelves of parchment rolls, a small safe and, most notably, a table positioned directly against the dividing wall. Upon that table stood a metal oil lamp, fitted with a narrow tubular shade that concentrated its beam forward. Holmes approached it without comment. He examined the shade, then lowered his head until his eye aligned with its opening. The tube pointed directly toward the wall. "A most interesting apparatus," he murmured. "It assists me in close reading," Armitage replied quickly. "The beam is confined to my papers." Holmes reached out and rotated the lamp a fraction to the left. The movement revealed upon the plaster behind it a small circular scar where the surface had been recently disturbed. Watson felt the blood stir in his veins. Holmes knelt and passed his fingers lightly over the spot. "A neat perforation," said he softly. "Drilled from this side." Armitage's voice grew sharp. "You have no warrant to—" Holmes rose. "The warrant will follow if required." Tell me, Mr. Armitage, are you acquainted with Sir Julian Rutherbourne? The man's lips compressed. Professionally. And did you, within the past week, receive from him any instruction regarding the Alderwick estate? Silence answered him. Holmes continued evenly. You occupy the room adjoining a strong room containing the original deed. You possess the technical skill to identify its importance. You have constructed a device by which light may be projected through a small aperture. And yesterday morning, at an hour when Holbrook habitually entered alone, you directed that light through the wall, thereby eliminating his shadow and preparing the ground for a most theatrical deception. Armitage's face had grown pale, yet his eyes burned with defiance. The deed was found in his desk. Placed there, Holmes corrected. The key was not duplicated, it was borrowed. Holbrook's coat, hung in the outer office, provided access to his pocket. A moment's abstraction at a substituted key, and the strong room was open. That is conjecture. Holmes's gaze hardened. It is deduction. The wax crumb we discovered was of your seal, not Sir Julian's. You opened the packet here, examined its contents, and resealed it with your own wax before returning it to the strong room shelf. Later, you removed it entirely and secreted it elsewhere, planting it in Holbrook's desk to divert suspicion. Armitage's composure cracked. You cannot prove... At that instant, there came a firm knock at the outer door. Holmes did not turn. I anticipated your anxiety, he said quietly. Thus I requested Inspector Lestrade to attend at 9 precisely. The door opened, and Lestrade's keen face appeared. Holmes inclined his head toward the wall and the lamp. Inspector, that you will observe the instrument by which a man's shadow was made to vanish, and a theft rendered plausible. Armitage sank into his chair, the bravado draining from him. But where, Lestrade demanded, is the deed? Holmes's eyes flicked to the small safe in the corner. Unless Mr. Armitage has been unusually bold, said he, it lies within arm's reach. Lestrade needed no second bidding. He crossed the room in 2 brisk strides and placed himself between Armitage and the small iron safe in the corner. The inspector's sharp eyes darted from the trembling conveyancer to Holmes. "Well, sir," said he, "shall we have it opened?" Armitage's hands gripped the arms of his chair. For a fleeting instant I believed he might spring up and attempt some desperate act. But the presence of Lestrade, compact, determined, and so now unmistakably suspicious, seemed to drain him of resolution. "You cannot compel me without a warrant," he said hoarsely. Holmes' voice was mild. On the contrary, Inspector Lestrade has already sufficient grounds. The drilled aperture, the lamp, the corroborating evidence from Trench and Fallow, these will justify immediate action. But I should prefer, he added with that cold courtesy of his, that you spare yourself the additional charge of obstruction. Lestrade stepped forward and rapped sharply upon the safe door. "Key," he said. For several seconds, Armitage did not move. Then, with a gesture of defeat, he reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small brass key. Lestrade took it and knelt before the safe. The lock turned with a dull metallic click. The door swung open. Inside lay a bundle of parchment tied with red tape. Even before Lestrade lifted it out, I recognized the seal, black wax impressed with the crest of Trench and Fallow. Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though a minor expectation had been fulfilled. Lestrade broke the tape and unfolded the parchment with care. His eyes scanned the opening lines. "Alderwick Estate Conveyance," he read aloud. "Dated 1814. "There, Inspector," said Holmes softly. "The original." Armitage gave a short, bitter laugh. "Very clever. You have found it. But you cannot prove I removed it from the strong room." Holmes turned to him, his grey eyes bright and merciless. "You underestimate the thoroughness of the law, Mr. Armitage. The drill you employed will bear traces of the plaster from Trench and Fallow's wall. The wax upon the resealed packet will match your own supply. And the timing of your early presence yesterday morning will be established by your charwoman, who, I suspect, observed you at work far earlier than your usual hour." A flush crept up Armitage's neck. Holmes continued, "Moreover, you have already betrayed the larger truth." "What truth?" Armitage demanded. "That you did not act alone." Lestrade glanced up sharply. "Not alone?" Holmes folded his arms. "The motive does not originate with Mr. Armitage. He is an intermediary, a man skilled in property law, in need perhaps of funds and susceptible to persuasion. The disappearance of the deed benefits only one claimant, Sir Julian Rutherbourne." The name seemed to hang in the air like the toll of a bell. Armitage's composure shattered at last. "He promised," he began, then checked himself. Holmes's expression did not soften. "He promised you what? So a generous consideration upon the successful assertion of his title? A share in Alderwick?" Armitage covered his face with his hands. "He said the deed was flawed, that it would only confuse matters, that if it were temporarily misplaced, a clearer chain of ownership might be established." "Temporarily misplaced," Holmes repeated with quiet irony. "And the theatrical device of the missing shadow. Whose invention was that?" Armitage's hands dropped. "Mine," he muttered. "I needed Holbrook discredited. If suspicion fell upon him at once, no one would examine the strong-room wall too closely. The trick with the light was simple enough. The gas behind him, my lamp before him. His outline vanished. He spoke of it in alarm. I knew they would dismiss it as hysteria." Holmes nodded. "You relied upon the tendency of reasonable men to reject the improbable even when it stands before them." Lestrade rose, the deed secured beneath his arm. "That will do, Armitage. You'll come with me." As the inspector placed a firm hand upon the conveyancer's shoulder, I observed not defiance now, but a curious expression of regret, perhaps not for the crime itself, but for its failure. Holmes watched silently as Lestrade escorted him toward the door. At the threshold, Armitage turned. "He will deny it," he said bitterly. "Sir Julian will swear he knew nothing." Holmes' eyes flashed. "On the contrary, he will not." When Armitage and Lestrade had gone, I faced my friend with astonishment. "You are certain?" "Entirely." "But upon what?" Holmes walked slowly to the drilled wall and placed his fingertips against it. "Sir Julian is ambitious, but he is not reckless. He will perceive that Armitage's confession is inevitable. He will attempt to shield himself with distance, but distance cannot explain motive, nor his repeated urgings to inspect the deed." "You intend to confront him again?" "At once." We lost no time. By noon we were once more admitted to Sir Julian's library. This time there was no polished composure awaiting us. He stood rigid by the fire as Holmes entered, the recovered deed visible in his hand. "I have it," Holmes said simply. Sir Julian's face blanched. "Mr. Armitage has been most communicative." For a long moment no one spoke. Then Sir Julian drew himself upright. "He is lying," he said. Holmes stepped closer. "He has described your meetings in detail, the sums discussed, the urgency you expressed. He has no reason now to shield you." Sir Julian's eyes flickered, not with anger but calculation. "You cannot prove," Holmes interrupted quietly. "I do not need to prove conspiracy in its entirety. Attempted fraud and inducement suffice. The deed remains intact. The law will examine the rest." Sir Julian's shoulders sagged ever so slightly. The air seemed to leave him. "It was mine by justice," he said at last. "Alderwick should have been restored." "Justice," Holmes replied, "is not served by drilling holes in walls and stealing shadows." Sir Julian gave a hollow laugh. When we departed once more into the London afternoon, the fog had lifted and a thin sunlight struck the wet pavements. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, slipping the deed into Lestrade's waiting hands outside, "a missing shadow has cast a long one indeed." I had thought, though as we quitted Bedford Square and turned our steps toward the Strand, that the matter was as good as concluded. The deed had been recovered, the intermediary apprehended, and Sir Julian's composure fatally shaken. Yet experience has taught me that Holmes rarely considers a case complete until every thread, however slender, has been drawn tight. "You appear dissatisfied," I remarked, observing the abstraction in his expression. Holmes did not immediately reply. We walked in silence for several paces, the thin winter sunlight lending London an almost deceptive cheerfulness. "At present," said he at last, "we possess recovery and confession, but not coherence." "Coherence?" "Armitage's confession, while useful, is incomplete. He admits to the mechanical contrivance and the removal of the deed. He implicates Sir Julian in motive. Yet there remains a disparity." "In what respect?" Holmes halted beside a bookseller's window and gazed absently at the spines within. "In temperament, Sir Julian is not a man who would entrust so delicate a scheme wholly to another. His pride is too pronounced, his caution too refined. And yet the execution, though clever, bore marks of improvisation." "You refer to the wax?" "Among other things. The crumb was left behind, careless, the drill scar imperfectly smoothed. These are not the habits of a meticulous aristocrat." I began to perceive his meaning. "You believe there was yet another hand?" Holmes resumed walking. "I believe Sir Julian supplied the impetus and Armitage the technical means. But the planting of the deed in Holbrook's desk required intimate familiarity with the internal routine of Trench and Fallow. Holbrook himself." Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. "A victim does not ordinarily contrive his own disgrace in so theatrical a fashion." We had by then reached Chancery Lane once more. Holmes led me directly into the offices of Trench and Fallow. Mr. Trench received us with visible relief. "The deed is restored?" he inquired anxiously. "It is," Holmes assured him, "but I require a small clarification. Yesterday morning, before Holbrook entered the strong room, who else was present in these premises?" Trench considered. "No one, to my knowledge. Holbrook habitually arrives first. And after him, my junior clerk, Mr. Phelps, at 8:30, then myself at 9. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "This Mr. Sir Phelps, how long has he been in your employ?" 3 years, a quiet fellow, reliable." "Does he possess access to the outer offices before you arrive?" "Yes. Each clerk holds a key to the main door." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "May we speak with him?" Phelps was summoned from a back room. He proved to be a young man of slight build and pale complexion, with nervous hands and eyes that darted too quickly. He greeted Holmes with evident unease. "You are aware," Holmes began evenly, "that Mr. Armitage has confessed to the removal of the Alderwick deed?" Phelps started visibly. I had not heard. "You also know," Holmes continued, "that the deed was discovered in Mr. Holbrook's desk?" "Yes, sir." Holmes stepped closer. "Describe, if you please, your actions yesterday morning upon arrival." I came at 8:30. So Holbrook was already here. He seemed agitated. I went to my desk and began sorting correspondence." "Did you approach Mr. Holbrook's desk at any time before Mr. Trench arrived?" "No, sir." Holmes' eyes drifted to the young man's cuffs. A faint smudge of black wax clung near the seam. "Curious," Holmes murmured. Phelps followed his gaze and hastily brushed at the spot. "From sealing envelopes," he said quickly. "Indeed. And yet your firm employs red tape and black wax only upon formal packets." Phelps swallowed. Holmes's tone hardened. "Mr. Phelps, you are acquainted with Mr. Armitage, are you not?" The denial rose to the young man's lips, then faltered. "We have met," he admitted weakly. "At Sir Julian's residence?" A tremor passed through him. Holmes pressed on. "You were observed leaving Bedford Square 2 evenings past. Armitage required knowledge of Holbrook's routine. Knowledge you supplied. You also possessed the opportunity to enter the office early and place the deed in Halbrook's drawer after Armitage delivered it to you. Phelps' composure collapsed entirely. I did not mean, he stammered. Sir Julian promised advancement, a position at Alderwick if the claim succeeded. I only agreed to help discredit Halbrook. I never touched the strong room. You did not need to, Holmes replied coldly. Armitage managed that portion. Your role was internal. You ensured the planted packet was discovered at the opportune moment. Mr. Trench stared at his junior clerk in horror. Is this true? He demanded. Phelps sank into a chair. He said no one would be harmed, he whispered, that Halbrook would recover in time. Holmes's expression remained impassive. Reputations are fragile instruments, Mr. Phelps. They do not recover so readily. Within the hour, Lestrade had been recalled and Phelps joined Armitage in custody. Sir Julian, confronted with corroborating statements from both men, offered little resistance thereafter. His ambition, stripped of its veneer, stood exposed. When at last we stepped once more into the street, I felt the peculiar exhaustion that follows prolonged tension. You were right, I said quietly. The scheme required 3. Holmes nodded. A triangle of motive, method, and opportunity. Remove one and the structure collapses. And the missing shadow? Holmes' eyes glinted faintly. A clever illusion. But every illusion casts a trace, Watson. One has only to determine where the light truly falls. Although the machinery of the law had now been set in motion, and Holmes showed no inclination to abandon the matter entirely. Indeed, as we made our way back toward Baker Street that afternoon, I observed in him not triumph, but a quiet vigilance, as though some final element remained unsettled in his mind. You are still not satisfied, I ventured. Holmes gave a slight shrug. Satisfied? Yes. But completion and satisfaction are not identical. A case is complete only when one has traced each motive to its root. You believe Sir Julian's ambition alone insufficient? Ambition rarely stands alone, he replied. It is nourished by grievance, by resentment, by the conviction of injustice. I would know which of these animated him. That evening, while I busied myself with my notes, Holmes penned a brief communication. The following morning we were admitted once more to Bedford Square, not as accusers, but as visitors under a peculiar truce. Sir Julian, though under looming indictment, had not yet been formally remanded, and he received us with the strained composure of a man whose world has narrowed abruptly. You return, Mr. Holmes, he said evenly. Have you come to moralize? Holmes removed his gloves and set them upon a side table. On the contrary, I seek understanding. Sir Julian regarded him warily, but gestured toward a chair. I remained standing near the mantel, content to observe. You asserted yesterday, Holmes began, that Alderwick was yours by justice. Explain that assertion. For a moment Sir Julian's reserve faltered, and something more human, more wounded, showed beneath. My grandfather, he said slowly, was deprived of the estate through a technicality in the conveyance. The deed held by Trench and Fallow confirms a transfer, which I have long believed irregular. For years I have sought to challenge it, yet without the original document my claim falters. It seemed intolerable that parchment alone should bar what blood demands. Holmes listened without interruption. And so, he continued, when Armitage suggested that the deed might be temporarily removed, merely examined, I allowed myself to consider it. I did not foresee the theatrics. The missing shadow? Holmes inquired. Sir Julian's mouth twisted. That was Armitage's flourish. I required only delay, confusion. He assured me it would divert suspicion. Holmes inclined his head. And had the deed vanished permanently, what then? I would have petitioned for a review, citing the absence of conclusive evidence. The estate might have been restored by presumption. Holmes rose and moved toward the window. You placed your trust in presumption. I place mine in proof. Sir Julian's shoulders sagged slightly. "You have made your point." Holmes turned back, and for the first time there was no cutting edge in his tone. "You are not devoid of honor, Sir Julian. That is why you faltered yesterday. A truly unscrupulous man would have denied all without hesitation." A faint, bitter smile crossed the aristocrat's face. "Is that meant as comfort?" "As observation," Holmes replied. "When we left Bedford Square for the final time, I sensed that some invisible tension had at last dissolved. You sought motive, I said as we walked, and found it." Holmes nodded. Resentment, cultivated over years, can distort judgment as surely as greed. And Sir Julian persuaded himself that he pursued justice. In truth, he pursued advantage. And Armitage? Opportunism, a man of middling talent who glimpsed proximity to wealth. And Phelps? Holmes's expression hardened briefly. Vanity, the promise of advancement. We had reached Baker Street once more. Holmes ascended the stairs with unusual lightness of step. Within our sitting room he cast aside his coat and, with characteristic abruptness, took up his violin. The first notes were low and reflective, as though echoing the subdued conclusion of our affair. I seated myself and watched the firelight flicker across his lean features. After some time he lowered the bow. "It is curious, Watson," he said thoughtfully, "how readily men accept the impossible when it flatters their suspicions. Halbrook spoke of a vanished shadow, and those about him concluded at once that he was unbalanced. None asked how such a phenomenon might be engineered, because it seemed absurd." "Absurdity is often the mask of design," Holmes replied. "The simplest physical principle, opposing light, was sufficient to create wonder." I smiled faintly. "And yet even you appeared intrigued." "Indeed, intrigue is the doorway to inquiry." He laid the violin aside and sank into his chair. "The missing shadow," he continued, "was never supernatural. It was merely misplaced illumination, but from that small deception flowed accusation, conspiracy, and attempted fraud." "And now?" I asked. Holmes' eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Now the shadow has returned to its rightful owner, and London, for the moment, is content." He reached for his pipe, when the familiar curl of smoke rose toward the ceiling. As for myself, I confess that I felt a renewed admiration for the singular clarity of my friend's mind. Where others saw marvel or madness, he perceived only light and its obstruction, and in that perception lay the unraveling of an intrigue which, had it succeeded, might have altered the fortunes of men and estates alike. Yet even as calm settled once more upon Baker Street, I could not dispel the memory of that bare plaster wall and the faint bar of light upon it. It seemed to me emblematic of Holmes himself, a narrow beam cast into darkness, revealing what others, blinded by assumption, had failed to see. For several days thereafter, the case of the Alderwick deed appeared in the public prints, with the customary embellishments and inaccuracies which so delight the popular imagination. The phrase, "the vanishing shadow," was seized upon with unseemly enthusiasm, and more than one columnist hinted at occult agencies where there had been nothing more mystical than a well-directed beam of light. Holmes endured these distortions with his usual indifference, though I observed that he clipped one particular article and laid it aside without comment. It was upon the fourth morning after the arrests that a visitor once again ascended the stairs of Baker Street. Edmund Halbrook entered our sitting room with an expression whole transformed from the haunted desperation of his first appearance. Though pale from recent strain, he carried himself with restored dignity. "Mr. Holmes," he said, grasping my friend's hand with fervor. "I've come to offer my gratitude. Mr. Trench has publicly cleared my name. The firm has retained me in my position." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "As it should." Halbrook hesitated, then produced from his coat a folded sheet. "There is one matter more. This was delivered to the office yesterday, addressed to me. It bears no signature." Holmes took the letter and unfolded it with care. I moved closer as his eyes ran swiftly over the lines. "Well?" I asked. Holmes handed it to me. The handwriting was firm, elegant. "You have been fortunate in your champion. Shadows may be restored, but reputations once dimmed seldom regain their full light. Take care that you do not again step where illumination is uncertain." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. "A threat?" Halbrook whispered. "An admonition," Holmes corrected. "And a revealing one." He examined the paper against the light, then held it to his nose briefly. "Watson," he said quietly, "what do you observe?" "The script is refined. The tone, almost philosophical." "Indeed. And the paper?" I looked more closely. "Fine quality, not common office stock." Holmes nodded. "Laid paper, watermarked. The faint crest here, Rutherbourne." Halbrook started. "Sir Julian?" Holmes folded the letter thoughtfully. No doubt written before he fully appreciated the weight of evidence against him, a final attempt at hauteur. "But he is under indictment," I said. "Would he dare?" "He dares nothing now," Holmes replied. "This is not menace, but wounded pride. He seeks to preserve an illusion of superiority." Halbrook drew a long breath. "Then I have nothing further to fear?" Holmes' gaze softened, though only slightly. "Fear is seldom dispelled entirely, Mr. Holbrook, but you have the advantage of truth." When our visitor had departed, I regarded Holmes with curiosity. "You expected something of the kind." "I anticipated a gesture," he said. "Sir Julian's character demanded it. A man so invested in appearances cannot resist the final word." "And yet," I persisted, "the letter speaks of reputations dimmed. Could he attempt retaliation?" Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "No. His power lies in influence and persuasion, both curtailed. Moreover, the exposure of his conspiracy has damaged him more thoroughly than any prosecution could." He rose and crossed to the mantel, gazing into the fire. "There remains," he continued after a pause, "just one small detail which has interested me." I smiled faintly. "I might have known." Holmes ignored the remark. When Armitage drilled the aperture between the offices, he relied upon precise alignment, yet he had no certainty that Halbrook would stand at the exact point required for the illusion. "True," I conceded. "The trick might have failed." Holmes nodded. "Unless someone ensured that Halbrook would position himself properly." "You mean Phelps?" "Precisely. It was Phelps who, on prior mornings, suggested the rearrangement of certain packets upon the shelf nearest the wall. He encouraged Halbrook to inspect them from that angle. A subtle preparation, but essential." I shook my head in admiration. The conspiracy was more intricate than it first appeared. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Intrigue thrives upon rehearsal, and the missing shadow was not a spontaneous marvel, but the culmination of small manipulations." He turned suddenly toward the window, where the afternoon light slanted across the panes. "Observe, Watson," he said, gesturing outward. "Even now, the sun stands at such an angle that your outline upon the opposite building is faint. Another hour, and it would vanish entirely." I followed his indication. Indeed, my shadow upon the distant brickwork was scarcely discernible. "Yet nothing supernatural has occurred," Holmes added. "Only geometry." He resumed his seat and reached for his pipe. The case, though resolved in law, offered an instructive reminder. Men will contrive elaborate artifices to cloak simple designs. They rely upon astonishment to forestall analysis. "And you," I said, "to rely upon analysis to dispel astonishment." A faint smile touched his lips. "A useful habit." As dusk approached, the familiar tranquility of Baker Street settled once more around us. The affair of the missing shadow had stirred London briefly, but already another scandal displaced it in the public mind. Yet for me, the memory remained vivid. The bare plaster wall, the engineered beam of light, the young clerk's trembling confusion. It was a lesson in how readily perception may be manipulated, and how swiftly truth reasserts itself when guided by a mind such as Holmes's. Outside, the lamplighter moved from post to post, coaxing small flames into being. With each fresh light cast upon the pavement, shadows sprang obediently into place. It might have been supposed that with the arrests secured, the deed restored, and Halbrook's honor publicly vindicated, the curtain would fall upon the matter. Yet scarcely a week had passed when an unexpected development stirred the embers anew. We were at breakfast when a hurried knock sounded below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice announcing Inspector Lestrade. The little detective entered with an expression at once vexed and alert. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. I thought you'd care to hear this directly." Holmes lowered his cup with deliberate calm. "Sir Julian has recanted." "Worse," said Lestrade. "He has fallen ill, collapsed in his cell last night. Claims he's been poisoned." I confess I started visibly. "Poisoned?" Lestrade nodded. "The prison surgeon finds no clear sign, yet Sir Julian insists someone seeks to silence him before trial." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And does he name the someone?" "He refuses. He says only that he has enemies." Holmes rose at once. "We shall visit him." Within the hour, we were admitted to a small infirmary chamber at the Jail. Sir Julian lay upon a narrow cot, his complexion sallow but composed. At our entrance, he regarded Holmes with a faint, ironic smile. "So the analyst of shadows returns," he murmured. Holmes approached the bedside. "You believe your life in danger?" Sir Julian's fingers tightened upon the blanket. "I believe," he said quietly, "that my misjudgment has placed me at the mercy of men less scrupulous than yourself." Lestrade folded his arms. "You accused no one." Sir Julian's gaze shifted briefly toward the inspector before returning to Holmes. "Armitage," he said at last. "He was desperate. I promised him much, more than I possessed. When the scheme collapsed, he looked at me as a drowning man looks at driftwood. If he thinks I might speak further—" Holmes regarded him steadily. "Armitage is secured in a separate wing." "Are you certain?" Sir Julian pressed. "He has acquaintances, clients who owe him favors." Holmes leaned closer. "Describe your symptoms." "A bitter taste," Sir Julian replied. "Dizziness, a tightening in the chest." Holmes turned to the surgeon. "Has he taken anything unusual?" "Only the standard fare," the man answered. "Bread, broth, water." Holmes requested a sample of the water jug and examined it, then the cup beside the bed. He lifted it to the light, sniffed, and touched a drop cautiously to his tongue. I could not repress an exclamation, but he merely shook his head. "Harmless," he said. "A faint trace of quinine at most." Sir Julian frowned. Then what?" Holmes's gaze drifted to the small window above the cot. It stood partially open, admitting a narrow shaft of daylight. "Inspector," Holmes said quietly, "at what hour did Sir Julian collapse?" "Shortly after dusk." Holmes nodded and moved to the window. Outside, a high wall bounded the yard. Upon its surface, I perceived the faint outline of iron bars casting shadows across the stone. Holmes examined the sill closely, then the interior wall near the bed. A curious discoloration marked the plaster, almost imperceptible unless one sought it. He turned back, eyes bright. "Sir Julian," he said, "did you observe anything unusual in the yard last evening?" The prisoner hesitated. There was a lamp beyond the wall. Its light seemed oddly directed. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. "Directed how?" "It shone straight through the bars. The shadows on the wall were distorted." Holmes stepped toward the plaster and indicated the faint mark. "And you, recalling recent events, perhaps allowed imagination to supply the rest." Sir Julian stared at him. "You mean—" "I mean," Holmes said evenly, "that no poison was administered. What you experienced was fear, intensified by suggestion. Lestrade frowned. Suggestion? Holmes nodded. The lamp outside was angled to project an unnatural pattern of shadows into this cell. After the revelations concerning the drilled wall and the missing shadow, Sir Julian is acutely sensitive to such phenomena. A mind under strain may interpret visual irregularity as imminent threat. Sir Julian struggled upright. But the bitterness, anxiety, Holmes replied gently, and perhaps the quinine in your water, prescribed to fortify you. The surgeon confirmed this with a nod. Lestrade scratched his chin. Then who angled the lamp? Holmes' eyes narrowed. That is the pertinent question. He moved to the window and looked down into the yard. A ladder leaned against the outer wall, unattended. "Inspector," he said, "I suggest you question the warder responsible for last night's lighting. It may be mere carelessness or an attempt at mischief." Lestrade departed at once. Sir Julian sank back upon the pillow, breathing more steadily now. "You see conspiracies everywhere," he muttered. Holmes's expression was unreadable. "On the contrary, I see the persistence of illusion. Once a man has contrived a missing shadow, he begins to perceive menace in every distortion of light." Sir Julian closed his eyes, and as we left the infirmary, I could not suppress my unease. "You believe it deliberate?" I asked. Holmes nodded slowly. Whether by Armitage's sympathizers or by some mischievous jailer, the lamp was angled with intent. The effect was calculated to unsettle. And Sir Julian, primed by guilt, succumbed. Precisely. Outside the jail, the afternoon light fell clear and uncompromised upon the pavement. "It appears," I said, "that the case casts longer shadows than we supposed." Holmes adjusted his gloves thoughtfully. "Shadows," he replied, "are obedient servants of light. But once a man has meddled with them, he may find they follow him more faithfully than he desires." Lestrade rejoined us before we had gone half the length of the street. His expression had altered from irritation to something nearer reluctant admiration. "No, the warder admits it," he said shortly. "Claims it was a jest. He'd read about the vanishing shadow in the newspapers and thought to unsettle the gentleman a trifle. Shifted the yard lamp so it shone through the bars at an angle. Didn't expect him to take ill." Holmes's lip curled faintly. A childish experiment with light, yet sufficient to revive the entire drama. "Sir Julian won't press the matter," Lestrade continued. "He's withdrawn the complaint. Says he was mistaken." "Very wise," Holmes replied. "The law has burdens enough without prosecuting foolish humor." When the inspector departed once more, I walked beside Holmes in reflective silence. The afternoon had grown bright and windswept. London seemed almost cleansed by the recent chill. "It is remarkable," I said at last, "how readily the illusion reasserted itself." Holmes inclined his head. The mind, once sensitized, interprets neutral stimuli as confirmation of fear. Sir Julian, conscious of guilt, required only a distorted shadow to imagine a poisoned cup. "And yet you suspected no true attempt upon his life?" "Armitage lacks the temperament for violence," Holmes replied. "His crime was calculated but not cruel. As for Phelps, he is frightened beyond measure. There remained no credible agent to silence Sir Julian." I reflected upon this. "Then the affair is truly at an end." Holmes paused beneath a plane tree whose bare branches cast delicate tracery upon the pavement. He regarded those shadows thoughtfully. "Yes," he said at last. "The machinery of justice will now proceed without further interference. Sir Julian's ambition, Armitage's opportunism, and Van Phelps' vanity have each met their consequence." We resumed our walk toward Baker Street. Within our sitting room, Holmes removed his coat and stood for a moment gazing at the familiar surroundings. The chemical apparatus upon the side table, the Persian slipper of tobacco, the violin resting near the hearth. "You perceive, Watson," he said quietly, "how a trivial physical principle may be employed to profound psychological effect." "The opposition of lights," I answered. "Precisely. Two sources placed in calculated relation, and the shadow disappears. It is no more miraculous than the eclipsing of a star. He seated himself and drew his violin across his knee, though he did not yet play. "What interests me most," he continued, "is not the ingenuity of the device, but the readiness with which intelligent men accepted its apparent mystery. Halbrook doubted his own senses. Trench dismissed the phenomenon as delusion. Even Sir Julian, once primed, perceived threat in ordinary illumination. "You alone," I said, smiling, "refused to credit the marvel." Holmes gave a short, amused breath. "My dear Watson, the marvel lay not in the shadow's absence, but in its supposed impossibility. Once that assumption is discarded, the explanation follows as naturally as day follows night." I could not resist a final question. "Had you not observed the faint bar of light upon the strong-room wall, might the deception have endured longer?" Holmes considered. "Perhaps for a day. No more. Illusions constructed upon mechanical means betray themselves under scrutiny. The aperture would have been discovered eventually. But reputations, once stained, might not have recovered so swiftly." At that moment there came a modest knock, and Mrs. Hudson entered with the afternoon post. Holmes sorted the letters with swift precision. One bore the crest of Trench and Fallow. He opened it and read silently before handing it to me. "Dear Mr. Holmes," it ran, "we are pleased to inform you that Edmund Halbrook has resumed his duties in full standing, and that the Alderwick deed has been secured in a newly fortified repository. Your assistance has preserved not merely a document, but the honor of this firm." Holmes folded the note and laid it aside without comment. "You see," I said warmly, "your intervention has restored more than parchment." He waved away the compliment. "The restoration was effected by fact, not by me." Yet as the evening descended and the lamplighter performed his quiet ritual along Baker Street, I observed Holmes standing once more at the window. The gas lamps flared, and shadows sprang obediently into being upon the opposite facades. "There is a curious comfort," he murmured, "in the predictable behavior of light. It is impartial. It reveals what stands before it without prejudice." "And shadows?" I asked. "Shadows," he replied, turning back into the room, "are merely the evidence of obstruction. Remove the obstruction, and they vanish. Introduce a second light, and they blur, but they never cease to obey natural law." He took up his violin at last, and the music that followed was neither triumphant nor somber, but contemplative, an exploration of themes resolved and harmonies restored. As for myself, and I recorded the events with renewed appreciation for the delicate interplay between perception and truth. A man's shadow may seem to desert him, yet the explanation may lie not in the man, but in the light that surrounds him. Thus concluded the case which began with a missing shadow and ended with its return. An affair that demonstrated once more that in London, as in life, the most perplexing mysteries often arise not from darkness, but from the misdirection of illumination. It was some months after the trial of Sir Julian Rutherborne that the last formal echo of the affair reached Baker Street. By then the summer had laid a gentler light upon London, and the fogs which had so often accompanied our inquiries had retreated before warmer winds. The courts had spoken with measured clarity. Armitage was sentenced for fraud and conspiracy. And young Phelps, whose weakness had been more pliable than malicious, received a lesser penalty. And Sir Julian, his pride at last stripped of ornament, faced the consequences of his calculated ambition. Yet it was not the verdict that drew the final line beneath the matter, but the quiet restoration of equilibrium among those it had unsettled. Holmes and I had been invited to Trench and Fallow's offices upon the morning when the Alderwick deed was to be sealed within a newly constructed strong-room. Mr. Trench himself conducted us below, where the chamber had been reinforced, the walls thickened, and, at Holmes's understated suggestion, the lighting simplified to a single central source. "You see, Mr. Holmes," Trench remarked with restrained satisfaction, "no opportunity now for theatrical interference. Holmes's eyes moved briefly over the arrangement. Simplicity is often the safest guardian. Edmund Halbrook stood nearby, no longer pale nor trembling, but composed. If any shadow lingered upon him, it was only that of remembered humiliation, one which time would soften. "It is strange," Halbrook said quietly, as the deed was placed within its secure compartment, "that my own perception was the first to mislead me. Had I not been so shaken by what I saw, or thought I saw, I might have examined the wall more closely." Holmes regarded him with calm approval. "On the contrary, Mr. Halbrook, your alarm was natural. The responsibility lay with those who exploited that natural response. Never reproach yourself for honesty." When the heavy door closed with a resonant finality, that I felt a sense of completion more profound than that afforded by any courtroom declaration. The physical document had been secured. Reputations, though tested, had endured, and the contrivance which had launched the intrigue lay exposed as nothing more than manipulated light. As we emerged once more into Chancery Lane, Halbrook paused. "Mr. Holmes," he said earnestly, "I have learned that truth, however momentarily obscured, cannot long be extinguished." Holmes inclined his head. "Truth requires only patience, and occasionally a lens." We took our leave, and as we walked westward, I could not help reflecting upon the curious symmetry of the case. It had begun with the apparent absence of a shadow, a phenomenon at once absurd and unsettling, and had ended with the reaffirmation of natural law. "You have been uncommonly reflective of late," I observed to Holmes as we neared Baker Street. He gave a faint smile. "It is the privilege of resolution, Watson. A problem once disentangled invites contemplation." "And what conclusion have you drawn?" "That men fear darkness less than distortion. Halbrook was not terrified by night itself, but by the violation of expectation, the sight of light behaving falsely. Sir Julian, later confined, succumbed to the same unease when confronted by manipulated shadows. The intellect rebels when natural order appears compromised." "And you?" I asked. "I seek the mechanism," he replied simply. "When the mechanism is understood, the fear dissolves." Back within our familiar sitting room, Holmes removed his coat and seated himself opposite the window. The afternoon sun entered at an angle that cast his own elongated silhouette upon the rug. He studied it for a moment, almost with amusement. "You see," he said lightly, "my shadow has not deserted me." "Nor ever shall," I returned. He reached for his violin and drew forth a quiet, contemplative melody, one of those wandering airs which seem less composed than discovered. The notes carried a serenity born not of triumph, but of equilibrium restored. As I committed the final details of the case to paper, I found myself dwelling not upon the cleverness of the drilled aperture, nor the calculated ambition of Sir Julian, but upon Holmes himself. Where others had perceived marvel or menace, he had discerned principle. Where reputations trembled upon the brink of ruin, he had interposed reason. The world, I reflected, is filled with shadows cast by ignorance, fear, and desire. Yet these shadows possess no substance of their own. They are but the byproducts of obstruction. Remove the obstruction, introduce clarity, and they recede. Holmes lowered his violin and regarded me with that familiar expression of detached curiosity. "You are moralizing again, Watson." "Perhaps," I admitted. He rose and crossed to the mantel where the fire burned low. "Let us leave morality to philosophers," he said. "Our concern is fact, and the fact remains that light, properly understood, cannot deceive." He extinguished the lamp beside him, allowing the waning sunlight to assume sole command of the room. The shadows lengthened naturally, obedient to geometry alone. Thus ended the case which had begun with a missing shadow and unfolded into a web of pride, opportunism, and fragile honor. It stands among those investigations which, though modest in bloodshed, proved rich in instruction. For in the end, it was not darkness that threatened truth, but the cunning manipulation of illumination. And against such artifice, the steady beam of reason remains the surest defense.